Good afternoon and welcome to week 9, day 2 of History and Systems of Psychology. Looking forward to spring break. I hope you have some fun things planned. I think when I last asked you, it was sleeping. Is that still the general consensus? Okay, well, happy napping and sleeping for vast periods at a time. I would like for you to get into, let's have 2 groups of 3 and a dynamic duo and talk about what you remember of William James from last class, okay? So we might, if the 2 of you want to come up here, and then we can do a trio here. Does that work? And a dynamic duo there? All right.
Sorry, that's such a bad thing.
Obvious to publish that.
Yeah. And we coin stream of consciousness as well.
Square resilience.
Yeah, he's just
See the person that also just has a random medical degree too?
Yeah,
He just has it, yeah, from Harvard. See the free will dude also?
yeah.
I heard that's another one of our
Like the
topics.
first active free will is war.
Yes. First person to kind of like tell that to a lot of other people, I feel. We're not good.
His siblings, his 2 older for him and his older brothers.
just lobby first.
He wrote like your book, right? He was more successful. And the 2 younger brothers both medical issues.
Just dies.
Yeah, this is very high.
His brother was an author.
She had like chronic cancer in 43.
Younger sibling of addicts, or was just one?
It was probably because of the
Because there was 2 that were really successful, and there was 2 that were like,
so they just kind of
Yeah.
There's a thing that's like, I didn't get the full thought out, but just says stream of consciousness. It's James' most famous psychological metaphor, but I just didn't write the metaphor. No. Get anything on it, really.
You liked, you had to look into dizziness and hypnosis and stuff, if someone who's intrigued by them, so like the population, like the mythical like type stuff. Yeah. So there's only one thing that's stunned in there, so that's
The messy is the thing.
Are you guys looking at that?
Yeah, I was just like, I wrote stream of consciousness and then nothing else for some
Oh,
reason.
okay.
So I
Well,
was like,
we'll clear that up,
I'm trying
right?
to see what it was about.
Yeah, so that's a famous metaphor, and we'll talk
That
about
is
what
the
that
metaphor.
metaphor is in just a moment. All right, let's hear from each of the groups. a tidbit or two about William James. And let's start here.
It took him 12 years to write the Principles of Psychology.
And do you remember how long it was?
1,700 pages.
Good job.
Too long.
Too long in his opinion, right? How about other people's opinion? Depending on who you asked, a lot of people actually thought it was was a really great text, chock full of all sorts of different subject areas within the realm of psychology and philosophy. All right, another tidbit from this group.
Talks about his stream of consciousness.
That's a popular one, all right. Okay, and does anyone remember what that metaphor stands for?
So the idea that you can like never step into the same stream twice, even though like its constituent parts may be the same, like the psychological experience never is.
Right, very good, yes. So if you were to go down to a stream, if you're a stream goer downer type of person, and you went there today, that stream would be slightly different when you went there next week, right? And things like rain, all sorts of things related to nature could play a role. The impact of how many people took rocks out of the stream and threw them, hopefully into the stream, not at other people. So this idea is that the mind is not composed of discrete elements. And a lot of earlier philosophers believed it was, right? But rather it's trying to think of, like, your experience is additive. So how you look at this material is going to be different than how you look at it when we come back from break. It's going to shift in terms of what you learn in the meantime, in terms of state of mind, all of those things. Okay, very good. So stream of consciousness, important. And now you know what the metaphor means. Okay, all right.
So we had, he was prone a little bit later in life due to his father's vestigations.
Yes, Prone to, I'm smiling at that, I shouldn't, but yes, that's right. Prone to vastations, and what's the definition of a vastation?
Kind of put like existential dread. It's just kind of like, what does it all mean? Like, what's the purpose?
What's the purpose of my life? You know, those deep questions that can keep one up at night, right? Or not, but he frequently went there, right? What's the meaning of life? He wanted a purpose-driven life. That was important to him, right? And he was very knowledge-driven. Depressed, right? I mean, we would diagnose him, well, I wouldn't because I'm not that kind of doctor, but someone might diagnose him with depression. Right? It sounds like he had some of those characteristics. And it definitely was a family issue, right? We see his father battling with these quote unquote demons. We also see how his brothers handle that, right? Through alcoholism. And then how about his sister? If I asked you on the exam to talk a little bit about James's family and how that family constellation impacted him, what do you remember about his sister?
His sister was prone to have hysterical breakdowns and be chronically incapacitated.
Right, and she actually became an invalid. And some of the reasons given for that had to do with the fact that the intelligence of women wasn't held in high esteem during that time. So she had a lot of things she wanted to do. You can imagine if we just consider like the genetic component of this family, intelligence is likely very, very high, right? But she wasn't given those opportunities. So feeling stifled, she turned inward. She became a complete invalid and died at age, I think it's 43 of cancer, right? Okay, excellent. So that was a lot having to do with vastations. How about one more thing for this group?
So I just put arts, chemistry, med school, jellyfish collecting, med school, the mechanistic physiological psychology.
And what are all those things?
It was a very like, well, okay, I don't think this is what I wanna do, let's switch. I don't think this is what I wanna do, let's switch.
Mhm.
Sometimes it was necessary, because the fortune was running out, so you needed to
Right,
do something
right.
practical. Sometimes it was just like, oh, this could be interesting, and then,
Sure.
yeah, I don't really like boxing jellyfish up, so we're gonna go back.
Yeah, boxing jellyfish. Yeah, creating them. I think that could be dangerous work, right? So yes, if we looked at the path of his life, we have some people that Angela Duckworth's an educational psychologist, and she talks about the concept of grit, right? It's a mix of passion and perseverance, and people who have high achievement in their particular field usually have a lot of grit. He had lots of different interests, right? So I would think he had grit in terms of his search for knowledge, but in terms of what he didn't follow any one path for very long before he shifted. So his stick-to-itness, for a variety of reasons, wasn't there as strongly as we see, say, in someone like maybe Helmholtz or Wundt, right? Okay. Though I guess Wundt had his own issues as well. Why did he not become an artist? That was his passion, and he showed a lot of talent.
His dad.
His dad, right? The threat of, I'm going to commit suicide if you decide you're going to be an artist, all right? What a threat. That's not a veiled threat. That seems like a very threatening thing to say. Yeah. So he did sort of bounce around. Medical school back in the day was seen as a practical profession. If you had money to get into medical school, or in the rare case, as with Helmholtz, he was able to get a scholarship of sorts, right, to go to medical school. That was sort of, you're going to do this and you're going to make money and be able to survive. All right, good. This group.
Something that was really important to him was the idea of free will.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
He believed that free will was like your internal agency in order for you to make choices in your life, and that he believed the first act of free will was to believe in free will.
I like the way you put that, internal agency to make, can you remind me what you said after
Make
that?
choices in your life.
Okay, so also this idea of autonomy is central to this, right? It's hard to have free will if you're not in an environment that will support that. Okay, good. What else?
We talked about how he had many physical and mental health issues in his life. Like he suffered from back pain, insomnia, anxiety, and depression. And then at a certain point, like it ties back into the free will, he debated committing suicide, but then he realized he had free will, and so he decided to push through and keep going.
Yeah, and tied into free will is, again, this idea of habit that we talked about a lot. He worked to make himself a more positive person. He worked to sort of deal with his depression in a way, I don't know if it's the most adaptive or not, but it seemed to work and alleviate a lot of his symptoms, and that was that habit. Wake up, you're going to do something, you're going to do it over time, consistently, and at a certain point, that's going to become an automatic response, but it takes time for those neural pathways to rewire, right? And that's why, like making a New Year's resolution and keeping that resolution can be really difficult, because you have to override. You may have a few things getting in the way, or you may have many things getting in the way of that. Anything else you'd like to say about William James? I want to go back to this idea of not only having some psychological issues, but also physical issues. He went to Brazil, right? He went on an expedition for, I don't remember, was it like 8 months? Okay. And he contracted something there, right? Do you remember?
Smallpox.
Mm-hmm. And so that had something to do with the deteriorating eyesight, and also potentially some of the back pain. He was just basically spent after that trip, and he knew what he didn't want to do with his life, right? He went to Germany, and what was his original purpose for going to Germany? Do you remember? Does this help?
German scientific method.
Was it for the mineral baths?
Yes, did that help you? No. Well, I was trying to depict water.
Oh, I was
stream
thinking
of
like hills and
consciousness.
valleys. It's like he's gonna go run or something.
Yes. No. All right. Now I'm thrown off. I throw myself off. Mineral baths, right? And whether it was psychosomatic or due to something that was really in that mineral bath, he became a lot better. Happenstance is that he fell upon mechanistic physiology, which was a big thing. And so then he decides mechanistic physiology is going to be what I do, right? What sent him back to medical school? Do you remember? So part of it was I need to make a vocation where I can make money to support myself because at the age of 30, I'm still living with my parents, right? Wasn't it his dad's death that sent him into a depression and eventually he went back to medical school? To take a look at that. Yeah. Okay. I really like this quote, and I talked about this in class on Tuesday, Wundt and James. So Wundt brought psychology to the university for specialists. Remember, on the exam, you'll need to talk about Wundt and the experimental method, right? He is credited as, sometimes people say the father of psychology, but I would say that's a little bit of a misnomer. I would call him the father of experimental psychology. All right, so his, the way he approached topics was broadly different from the way that William James did, right? William James was much more, I have these ideas and I'm going to present them to you to consider thoughtfully. He made psychology a living subject for anyone who chose to read his work or listen to him, okay? What did his students have to say about him as a professor?
They really liked him as a professor, right? He was a really good teacher.
Right, and one of the hallmarks of his teaching method is that he sought to engage with the students, and the students remarked being treated as equals, which I would guess didn't happen a lot at Harvard, especially back in the day. So intellectual equal, he was a lifelong learner, so as he learned more, he didn't just have the same stagnant lesson plan from semester to semester, he would revise. Okay. Okay, and we talked about our own habits. Remember that the James Lange theory of emotion says that emotions are the consequence rather than the cause of physiological effect. You might put a star by emotion and William James and make sure you study that carefully for the exam. All right, I wanted to talk a little bit about his later career. Another item that was mentioned earlier was the idea that William James thought his work was of no importance. It was bloated, it was too long. I feel bad for whoever happens to read it. Well, that philosophy followed. He became increasingly frustrated by the limitations and uncertainties of the science he had so brilliantly written up. Because everyone, even at that point, I mean, psychology a lot of times was called something else, or it was philosophy, and you figured out a way to place psychology within it. So it wasn't a huge entity yet. Even so, with this uncertainty, he was two-time president of the American Psychological Association, which is a pretty major deal. I wanted to read about this. I think it's, if nothing else, it's quite interesting. He got into, I would say like in later adulthood, spiritistic phenomena. Okay, not unlike some others that we've mentioned. So that was a big thing, and I'm reading on page 293. He got interested in psychical research, a topic much in the news at the time, as several self-proclaimed mediums claimed to have the ability to communicate with departed spirits. Wundt was skeptical of this, which would just be what you would expect from him, right? James, however, became a leader in an organization devoted to the scientific investigation of the phenomena, the American Society for Psychical Research. James openly hoped to find convincing positive evidence for paranormal phenomena, but time and again, his hard data proved inconclusive or worse. And this is one of James' friends composed a poem. You guys can go back to your natural environment if you so desire. And it says, this poem is, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch Eusapia by the toe. If she hollers, then you know James's theory is not so." And so this particular instance, why the toe is mentioned, is that there was a famous medium named Eusapia Palladino. She would produce psychic manifestations through contortionist-like movements of her foot, okay? Her seance came to a humiliating end after the observer seized her foot and composed that poem. James took the jibe in good spirit and shortly before his death confessed that despite devoting 25 years to psychical research, he had drawn really no divisive conclusions about the existence, all right? And he said, you know, this can't be completely dismissed, but there's really not that empirical evidence to back up this spiritistic phenomena as a true thing. Okay, we are going to, I'm going to exit out of here and move up here. All right. Okay, so we've done the psychical, spiritistic thing. Now he continues to grow regarding his religious experiences as well. He was never a theologian, everyone. Instead, he examined religious experiences, feelings, states of mind, and other subjective phenomena as a psychologist. That's much different than being in the field of theology. He viewed science as objective, general, and impersonal, while viewing religion as subjective, individual, and personal. And toward the end of his life, a lot of people, as they get older, and I see this in myself, the spiritual side becomes more important. So whatever, like believing in something, having purpose in life. And so he became more fully invested on the religious side of things toward the last decade of his life. Okay, what I want you to do, and you can do this on your own and then we'll share out, is I want you to see what you can find on William James and Alcoholics Anonymous. The big book, it was constructed by several different people, and I won't mention them now, but both Carl Jung and William James are cited within the big book, and AA uses this idea of habit, right? The habitual, you go to meetings, you do X, Y, and Z every day, and that was modeled after what William James had to say about habit. So if you don't have a computer with you, if you want to pair up with someone, have a phone, I want you to see what you can find, and I'll give you about 5 minutes, okay? Maybe pull down a little bit if you enter in William James and AA, scroll down to perhaps things further down the food chain, if that makes any sense at all. And while you're doing that, I'm going to hand out something we'll talk about later. There you go.
And that's something everyone will discuss toward the end of class. Yeah, because it keeps blinking on and off. I appreciate that. Finding anything interesting? Let's take about 3 more minutes. Finding anything interesting? My shoes are squeaking so much. Okay, I'd like to take a few minutes and hear from you regarding what you found. Something that was of interest. Who would like to venture out and say something?
So I found one from AA Agnostica. Basically, 1890, William James is believed to have presented the first theory of neuroplasticity in the Principles of Psychology. He didn't call it that, but the meaning was clear. He was the first person to pointed out that the human brain was malleable and capable of reorganizing. Basically, that those things that are habits for us, like they don't have to be habits.
Right, right.
Because it's there now, it doesn't mean it has to be there 6 months from now.
Yeah,
The
yes.
idea is set up better habits to replace the maladaptive ones.
Right, and up to that time, and even I think later, if someone was a chronic alcoholic, they ended up going into like a ward of sorts and living the rest of their life in a hospital, in a facility, because they were considered untreatable, unable to be treated. And it took a while after 1890 to figure out that that wasn't the case, that they could be treated. And someone who was instrumental in that was actually a doctor, Dr. Silkworth, who had been an alcoholic himself. So it's very, very interesting to talk about, I think. And for those of you who are going to go into therapy, I don't know if you've taken the addictions class with Dr. Sharp, but I know she talks about AA a little bit. So if you've not taken that class, you may be doing that in the future. Other thoughts?
I found that there's like a 12-step program for Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's like known as kind of the Jameson concept of willingness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like step 1 where they kind of admit that they're powerless over alcohol. Step 2, then they come to believe that there's a power greater than themselves that can restore them.
Which also sounds like James and spirituality, right?
And then you'll go through 12 steps of reflection, like that James had written, I guess.
Yeah.
Understand.
Yeah, and the idea is that you're living the 12 steps in your life and striving always to be a better version of yourself, which isn't a bad idea for anyone. Within that, they do have a section where you make amends to people that you've harmed, but there's so much of it that in terms of the philosophy that you can see William James and when we talk about Carl Jung, Jung's influence. Kylie, do you have something for us?
I read about Bill Wilson.
Uh-huh.
And how he was like influenced by James's spiritual experiences, like his book, The Varieties of Religious Experiences.
Yes, uh-huh.
And he was hospitalized for detoxification, and he had like this spiritual awakening. And he did this like thing where he saw the white light and used James's work to kind of inspire AA, like he co-founded it, so.
Yeah. So among the oodles of things that James did for us, the long-lasting legacies, that's an important, I mean, it's small in the realm of everything that he did, but an important one, right? Anyone else have anything to share? No? Okay. One thing I need to circle back to on Tuesday is pragmatism. The philosophy of pragmatism is like super important, and I completely skipped that. So please remind me if I don't talk about it. Okay, so one of the lasting legacies, or maybe the overarching legacy of James, is he created an atmosphere about psychology that made it seem interesting and worthwhile to pursue. And his ideas were like active application sorts of things that you can do. He didn't just say XYZ exists as problems, but he was a problem solver. And these are ways you can apply this new field of psychology to your life. G. Stanley Hall, we're going to talk about him next. He was a psychologist and also educator. And he coined the term adolescence. It hadn't been a term until he came around. He did a lot in terms of child development research. And anyway, the two of them met when they were both at Harvard, of course, and encountered each other as teachers. Hall was really young and just starting out there. James was not. And James took Hall under his wing for a period of time, and he learned a lot from him. And it's kind of interesting to see what G. Stanley Hall had held on to long-term and what he sort of discarded. All right, so we will now watch a short video about G. Stanley Hall.
If you're using ChatGPT but don't know how to monetize it, watch this video to the end. Alright, step.
This is Granville Stanley Hall, a key player in the development of psychology as a prominent field of academia in the United States. Hall was born on February 1st, 1884 in Massachusetts. He was always an avid learner, but his interests varied a lot. First, he went to seminary, studying to become a member of the clergy. But he became interested in psychology and began studying it at Harvard. In 1878, he became the recipient of the first doctorate in psychology ever rewarded in the United States. Unfortunately, there were no academic jobs for American psychologists at the time. After a brief time spent in Europe, Hall ended up teaching English and philosophy in the U.S. In 1882, having been recognized as an excellent teacher thanks to his guest lectures, he was taken on by Johns Hopkins University to teach his true passion, psychology. Psychological study was gaining greater prominence in American academia, and Hall was dedicated to advancing that study as much as he could. In 1883, Hall started the first American psychology lab there at Johns Hopkins. In 1887, Hall launched the American Journal of Psychology, a paper that, quote, explores the science of the mind and behavior, publishing reports of original research in experimental psychology, theoretical presentations, combined theoretical and experimental analyses, historical commentaries, and in-depth reviews of significant books, unquote. This continues to be in publication to this day. Hall stayed at Johns Hopkins until 1889, when he was offered the role of president at the second graduate school to be established in the United States, Clark University. During his tenure as president at Clark, Hall continued to contribute to the growing field of psychology. In 1892, Hall helped found the American Psychological Association, an organization that has a sustaining influence in its vision to, quote, advance psychology to benefit society and improve lives, end quote. They also decide how students like us format our papers. Ever heard of APA style? This is the format recommended by the American Psychological Association for all scientific publishing. In 1904, Hall published a book called Adolescence, Its Psychology and Its Relation to Physiology, Anthropology, Sociology, Sex, Crime, Religion, and Education. Besides being a pretty big mouthful to say, this book influenced psychology significantly by describing adolescence as a distinct stage separate from childhood and adulthood. And in 1909, Hall helped to establish one of the most significant voices in psychology ever, Sigmund Freud. Believe it or not, Sigmund Freud was kind of a bad boy. While he did not invent the psychoanalytical approach, he formalized and promoted it. Receiving an invitation to speak about his theories and commitment to the new therapeutic approach from such an established person as G. Stanley Hall legitimized Freud in many ways. His innovative theories and methods were generally frowned upon by the establishment. When Hall asked Freud to come to America and speak at Clark U's 20th anniversary celebration, Freud initially said no, partly because of prior commitments and partly because of anxiety about how his theories would be received in the U.S. It wasn't until Hall almost doubled his initial honorarium that Freud finally gave in, saying, "I've always wanted to see an American porcupine." But he was still nervous. On the boat ride over from Europe, he said to his friend and co-speaker Carl Jung, "Once the Americans discover the sexual core of our psychological theories, they will drop us." Freud needn't have worried. His 5 days of lectures went over incredibly well, even though they were all in German. Freud later nicknamed Hall the Kingmaker, due to his part in raising several pioneering psychologists to prominence. Hall finally retired from Clark U in 1920. Even after retiring, he continued to influence psychology, publishing another book called Senescence in 1922 about the psychology of aging. Hall is one of the most influential American psychologists in history, and I think we can all see why.
Okay. Interesting graphics on that video. It was a little uneven, right? We saw like the first 2 minutes, all of these universities, and then smiley faces and frowny faces. But really good information, however it is conveyed. This is not the right one, is it? Here we go. Okay. All right, so I want to get a little bit deeper into G. Stanley Hall's early life. He was born in Massachusetts, like they said, in 1844 and lived until 1924. So 80 years, that was a long time back in the day, really long time. His father was an educated farmer. The book seemed like it was really important to mention he was not just a farmer, but an educated one. And his mom was a teacher. So he was influenced by both his mom and his dad to view education as something very important. He entered Union Theological Seminary after graduation from Williams College in 1867. Now, in the video, it sounds like he just decided to do something else, right? Like he's not going to be a member of the clergy. The reasoning behind that is more interesting, however. Okay, so let's see. On page 296, his mother was unhappy when Hall went off to the big city and seemed to not like theology very much, finding Darwinian theory much more appealing. Going on, Hall recalled that after he preached his trial sermon to faculty and students at the seminary, the president did not offer a customary critique and commentary, right, as you would do, but rather knelt and prayed for the salvation of Hall's soul. Realizing his prospects must lie elsewhere, Hall borrowed money for 3 years of independent study in Germany, where he concentrated on philosophy and also studied physiology. So I thought that was interesting that he was actually prayed for, like, this is so not what you need to do, and we hope you figure it out. But please don't become a fellow member of the clergy. All right, he obtained a junior appointment teaching philosophy and religion at Antioch College. He had taught before this time, but was let go because he harbored what they refer to as Darwinian sympathies. He read the work of Wundt and hopped on the experimental bandwagon. That was something that really interested him. And it appears to be a better fit than seminary. He planned a trip to meet and study with Wundt in Germany. However, before he started his travel, he was offered an instructorship in English at Harvard. So he accepts that. He met James there, and James pushed him to explore psychology. So he was a mentor of G. Stanley Hall, and then you heard in the video, G. Stanley Hall became a mentor to a new era of psychologists. So, and if we think back and we reflect on all the mentorship, you can see it plays a strong role way back in the day with philosophy into this time period. As the person in the video said, he received the first American PhD in research and experimental psychology. That was a huge deal. Okay, so after he accomplished that, pretty big accomplishment, he decided to go visit Wundt. And Wundt wrote him recommendation letters for future openings in psychology. So he basically got the endorsement, received the endorsement of James as well as Wundt. And those endorsements have a lot of weight, right? So that was good for him. He was invited by the Harvard president to teach lectures in education and pedagogy. What does pedagogy mean? What's it? It's the study of. Are you looking it up?
Yeah.
Teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, so study of teaching. If you are someone who is an elementary education teacher, you'll take a variety of classes. Many of them will be pedagogical in nature, focusing on classroom behavior, maybe how to work best with parents. So that is training for the education of others. His interest in developmental psychology and pedagogy grew during this time. As was mentioned, he took a post at Johns Hopkins University. And Johns Hopkins was the first university in the United States that was modeled after the German system of psychology. So there's such a strong German influence on what psychology looked like back in the day and what it looks like today. Wundt's recommendation led to the first professorship of psychology and pedagogy in 1884. So fairly accomplished at a young age. He was given a lab at the university. He established the American Journal of Psychology in 1887, and that was the first journal that focused exclusively on research in the area of experimental psychology. Remember, that was still a pretty new thing. For some reason, I have written down, read page 298 top. Oh, okay. So, Hall wants to start a journal, but he doesn't have money to do so. You know, that's going to cost some money. It says, in his quest to raise funds to start the journal, Hall attracted the interest of a wealthy member of the American Society for Psychical Research. Remember psychical research? Who donated $500 under the assumption that Hall would be favorable to this line of research. So he had some ideas in mind. I'm going to give you this money and you're going to maybe promote psychical research, which we know James said is interesting, but really not a thing, not an academic thing, so to speak. Hall was certainly not intending to publish psychical studies, being critical of the whole endeavor and intent on making the new journal rigorously scientific and empirical. Nonetheless, he accepted the money. To what extent he misled the donor is unknown, but he did develop a reputation for opportunism that stayed with him throughout his career. He was appointed the first president of Clark University in 1888. Shortly thereafter, he suffered personal tragedies. He became very ill with diphtheria to the extent that he could not preside over Clark University. He had to retreat to his childhood home where his parents were taking care of him, and he convalesced there and recovered, right? When he returned to his residence, he found that his wife and 8-year-old daughter had died of accidental asphyxiation. And the son, who I believe was 9, was the only survivor. There are lots of different ways you can deal with this, but the book talks about the fact that, you know, he could have been someone who says, I'm going to leave what I'm doing and, you know, either do something else or maybe just sort of stay in this stagnant place throughout their life, because certainly those are huge tragedies. He dealt with a lot of it by throwing himself into his work even more. And you can already tell he's a work thrower inner from all of this. Okay, he was elected to APA. Wundt's influence was evident in his lab work, journal, and professional studies. So this is, you can see the dual influence. So the lab work, the rigor of experimental psychology, the journals and what were published in his journals, and professional studies were in line with what Wundt had to say about psychology. But his research itself belong to functional practical world of James, his own research. His most innovative work came from a combination of psychology, pedagogy, and evolutionary theory. As was noted earlier, his mom was dismayed when she found out that he supported this Darwinian theory. So evolutionary psychology played a big role in this. He was so good, I think, of taking topics that may seem kind of disparate and bringing them together in a cohesive way. In the 1880s, he designed and gave a large series of questionnaires to kindergarten-age students. I'll have to see if I can find some of those questionnaires for you for next time. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to question kindergarten-age students? Plus, you need a lot of napkins or Kleenexes or napkins on hand because they have runny noses all the time. In 1893, he published the results of his work, and the title of this publication was Contents of Children's Minds Entering School. And this was actually directed toward people who were becoming teachers, so people who were going to be educating kids of this age. This is where they are, this is what you need to know. Again, the pedagogical component to be a good teacher. Any questions on this? I know it's a lot of information. You good? Okay. Oh my gosh, is that it? It wasn't as much information as I had thought it was. Okay. Well, pragmatism. Yeah, let me finish up here and then I'll give us time, thank you, so we don't have to hold that. Okay, so one of the books that he published was on adolescence, all right? And let's talk about how we classify developmental periods. To a certain extent, it depends on who you ask. Like Erikson had his own idea about development, and there were the 8 stages of development, and you went through a series of crises, ranging from the first stage, trust versus mistrust, to later life, generativity versus stagnation, okay? Freud, on the other hand, looked at development in terms of psychosexual stages, okay? And Carl Jung looked at it as occurring throughout the lifespan, with middle age being the time when you're supposed to grow as much as you can as a person in the process of individuation. Anyway, early on, if we talk about just broader periods, not specific to a given psychologist or developmentalist, we had childhood and what? All right, you were a child, and when you were old enough, you were caring for younger children, and it was very quickly that you moved into this. Okay, so G. Stanley Hall, in his research, determined there's something between childhood and adulthood, and that something was adolescence. He described adolescence as a tumultuous period of time for everyone who is near the adolescence. So the adolescent is searching, going through, taking all these risks, and that actually has to do with the amygdala being fully formed, but their prefrontal cortex is not. So there's some reasons why they're doing that, right? And challenging rules, challenging authority figures. So he said it's a period of storm and stress. Today, we look at adolescence more like this. Rather than having all this stress occur, particularly in the home, it's this idea of roots and wings. So the idea of the parent helping the adolescent move into adulthood by giving them roots and a firm foundation, but also this idea that we want you to be autonomous and we support that. So I just wanted to mention how our conceptions have changed. We have more classifications now. We have emerging adulthood, all right?
So emerging adulthood is going to be that time period
From around 18 to 25, where you're getting out on your own, you're exploring, continuing to explore your identity. Then we get to early adulthood and late adulthood. All right. So where G. Stanley Hall focused was right here, childhood and adolescence. Okay. Let's see. This is what, I actually think that I deleted several slides because originally it showed that I had 15 slides. So I think what I was mentioning has to do with Hall was very much of his time, and as much as he was a supporter of Darwin, he also seemed to have a healthy dose of this eugenics idea. So he thought less of people who weren't white, people who weren't male. Okay, and the textbook expands on this on page 300. He says, Hall recommended that educators encourage and support boys, especially white boys, to systematically relieve all the racial strains of their diverse ethnic heritage in order to reach the highest stage of evolution, because those are the people who can reach the highest stage of evolution. This necessitated a prolonged adolescence for boys. They're going to express their savage origins and pass through them, emerging eventually to help create a race of supermen who would reach their full evolutionary potential. And then they're going to pass this high order thinking, feeling person, those genetic traits on to future. So you can definitely see eugenics playing a role in that. I want to talk a little bit more about this. He says he felt other races didn't have the advanced final stages of evolutionary development in their ancestral past, so there's no reason to prolong their adolescence. They don't need that extra time to grow and learn. They're going to fall behind, and it's going to happen during this time period. They're going to fall behind their white peers in terms of educational potential and achievement. Okay, what he has to say about women is equally, I think, appalling. And so if you want to follow along, I mean, it's like, really, G. Stanley Hall? Okay. So I'm going to read one more paragraph, which would have been one of the slides you would have looked at. Hall believed in the prominent variation hypothesis that males carry greater physical and mental variability due to their need to compete with others for access to the more sexually passive females. Males were carriers of this variability and therefore the only ones who could pass it on to the next generation. Although females might be able to relive their primitive evolutionary heritage, they would be unable to develop advanced traits that could be passed on to their offspring. In fact, it was widely believed that prolonging the education of young women during puberty could damage their reproductive organs by diverting blood from their reproductive systems to the brain. Thus, Hall advocated a different, less intellectually strenuous education for women. Nice stuff, right? That was facetious, not nice stuff. So this is really weird because on the one hand, he held these ideas, and so you would think that he would not want much to do in the academic front with people who weren't white and people who weren't female. But in fact, he mentored the first husband and wife team of psychologists who just happened to be African American. He also mentored Calkins, who was a female psychologist. So it's interesting to see that he harbored these ideas and it shaped his philosophy, but then he still worked with these people. So maybe he saw them as these are just, they're not like all other females or they're not like all other people from races, but I thought that was interesting because those two things are very contradictory. Okay. We will talk about next week the last PhD student that Hall supervised, Francis Cecil Summer. He was the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology. Okay, and I'm sorry, he didn't mentor the husband and wife teams, rather Sumner mentored the husband and wife team. I just wanted to make that correction. And then we'll spend a nice amount of time on Mary Calkins. Really interesting. So many challenges she went through as someone who was a female born in 1863. Very educated, worked as a professor. Yeah, pragmatism. I want to circle back to that. So we're situating ourselves in the last decade at this point of James's life, okay? And on page 293, he was introduced to Charles Sanders Peirce, who was a Cambridge friend and part of the Metaphysical Club, of which James was a member. Sanders Peirce promoted a view he called pragmatism, according to which scientific ideas and knowledge can never be absolutely certain. So there's no absolute truth, right? And when we talk about hypothesis testing, we never say we reject a hypothesis. We say we fail to reject it. And also we say how confident we are that our results are not due to chance, but we don't ever say we're 100% confident. So this idea that ideas and knowledge to some extent are going to be flawed. They're never absolutely certain, but only subject to varying degrees of, in quotes, pragmatic belief. In other words, ideas worked with varying degrees of effectiveness in adapting to the world. And we'll spend just a little bit more time on that. It's a really interesting topic, and I can't believe that I skipped it because I like James so much, but I did. All right. Okay, I want you to take about 5 minutes. We've talked ad nauseum almost about Harvard in this class. And I just thought it would be interesting to look at this. I was trying to find articles about Harvard that talk about the 1800s and 1900s. This is earlier, I believe, and it comes out of their journal. No writer attributed January 3rd, 1888. I'd like for you to spend the next 5 to 7 minutes. You're going to read through what a day or a week at Harvard looked like. It's pretty amazing. So feel free to highlight anything that's of interest to you. Some of this is amazing, and some of this is like, really, they did that? But I thought we would find it quite interesting. So I'm going to read along for a second, go through as you do that. And I will also post this, an electronic version, to our class online, our online shell. You know what I mean. about 2 more minutes, and then I'd like to hear from you about what you found interesting. Okay. What did you find interesting?
How important the Bible was in order to get your degree. Be able to translate passages from the Bible from Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic into Latin, and expound biblical text in order to get your bachelor's degree.
Yeah, which sounds like a ton of work, right? But it's interesting that it played such a big role when you could go to seminary, right? It was still very much part of the curricula at that time. Others?
Okay, first of all, it's insane to me. Like, they don't even get to choose anything on their
Oh my
own.
goodness, no, there's lack of choice, right?
And then to even get to Harvard, you just have to, the main admission, or this Latin was the main requirement for admission for Harvard College. So you may not have even been like top of anything. As long as you can speak Latin, then you're like pushed way higher.
Yes, and I would guess that they want pretty fluent Latin speakers. Most of the men that would deem themselves worthy of being admitted would have likely grown up learning Latin. That was something that was done back in the day. Good. Others, please. Jasmine, do you have something you found interesting? Nothing? Colby, how about you?
I think the Latin one was pretty crazy. I know he said it was like the main admission, but I thought it was pretty wild that it was required to speak Latin in the classrooms and in the college yard.
Yeah, as a first year student, right? I think that was the requirement. After that, maybe you had your mother tongue, so to speak. A couple of things. I mean, I found a lot interesting because I underlined and circled almost half of it, which means that it's hard to discern the most interesting. Well, we know forenoon is morning, right? That hopefully made sense to you. I like this. I was just thinking of them on a Saturday afternoon at 1:00. So they had their 12 o'clock dinner together. They were taught history in the winter
And the nature of plants in the summer. I thought that was interesting. And on that note, it says, if you turn to the back, Saturday afternoon was a half holiday, except that the first hour of it was improved by the college in hopes that after an introduction to history in the winter and to the nature of plants in the summer, students would further improve these fields of study during the remainder of the afternoon. So you would be very intellectually stimulated by the content, and you would want to read it and maybe go out into the yard and look at, that's a hydrangea, you know. I'm being facetious, but I just, like, it paints a good picture of what life was like, and my gosh, how rigorous could this be? The focus was on what? It was on the arts, right? It was on things like epistemology too, which is basically the study of the like roots of words, like the meanings of words. And then I wasn't familiar with this, linguistics. So prosody, study of elements of speech, including intonation, stress, rhythm, and loudness that occur simultaneously with individual phonetic segments. So some linguistics there, and it makes sense because they were teaching people how to be leaders. There were lots of classes on rhetoric, and that was especially true if you were wanting to go into the academic realm. Did you see that math took up, what was it, like 2 hours? I mean, it was really minuscule. Yeah, it was minuscule in relation to other things, right? So those were just a few of the items I found interesting. I want to say a couple of things about the exam. So I have the exam questions and they're typed out. I'm almost through with it. I have to move all of it into a different format, and it's really time consuming to get it on the computer the way that it wants me to. But there might be a few things I want to cover really quickly. What's the difference between the phenomenal and noumenal world? Or what's the phenomenal world?
Like how you perceive an object versus what it actually is.
Which is noumenal.
Yes.
What did Volcker psychology focus on?
It's not like the folklore one where you study. No.
So it looked at different things like collective products of human psychology, study of language was important. It was looking more at social and cultural factors rather than using the experimental method. Okay. Those are two that I wanted to mention. Make sure you understand who Wallace is and his relationship to Darwin. And I hope that you have a wonderful, safe spring break and happy napping and sleeping for longer periods of time.